Okay, so hi and welcome all. I'm Beat Kümin, one of the early modernists in the History Department and the host of this research seminar as coordinator of the Warwick Network for Parish Research. Founded in 2003, we now have around 300 members from numerous countries and disciplines, and our aims are to support comparative approaches to the study of local religion and society, to run an annual symposium on varying themes. On the 8th of May, we'll talk about parish power and politics. And we want to facilitate research exchange via our online platform called My Parish, the address of which you can find on the History Research seminar page where you just came from. Before we get going, let me just inform and warn you that this session is being recorded so that our discussions can eventually be made available on the My Parish site and internally to all Warwick participants. I'd also like to thank Amy Evans for her help in preparing and running this seminar. I just thought I'd share a little couple of photographs with you as by means of a introduction, and I'll just see whether I can see that on my screen. Try that again. Yeah, so today we are focusing on the significance and the longevity of the parish, one of the first territorial units of organization in European history, full stop. What I'm sharing here are just two visual images to symbolize this kind of longevity. On the left-hand side is a parish font from the Alpine region, dating from the early 14th century, signifying the original purpose of the parish, which was to facilitate the cure of souls and to bring people to the sacraments, crucially baptism. And then on the right-hand side is, just on my doorstep, a reminder that still in the 21st century, the parish is a fundamental unit of local identity, commemorating here the men of the parish from Bishop Stachbrook who died in the Great World War. So I think as a unit with such a long history, the parish is ideally placed for comparative and transnational approaches. Indeed, the immediate occasion for this session is the preparation of a companion to the parish, which I'm co-editing with a German colleague to examine the phenomenon from the High Middle Ages right across Europe and indeed beyond. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce two American colleagues with whom I've been collaborating literally since the last century, particularly through our anthology, The Parish in English Life, 1400 to 1600, which appeared in 1997. Katherine French is J. Frederick Hoffman Professor of History at the University of Michigan. She's a medievalist specializing in women, medieval communities, especially the town of Westminster, and the material culture of the period. Her monographs include The People of the Parish, 2001, The Good Women of the Parish, 2007, and the immediately forthcoming Household Goods and Good Households in Late Medieval London, Domesticity and Consumption After the Plague, all from University of Pennsylvania Press. Gary Gibbs, in turn, is Professor of History at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. His research focuses above all on London, exemplified by his 2019 monograph, 5 Parishes in Late Medieval and Tudor London, which offers a set of comparative microhistories across the 15th and 16th centuries. Gary is currently also transcribing the Church Wardens accounts of St. Botolph Aldersgate with Valerie Hitchman, and has served as book review editor of the 16th Century Journal for how many centuries? 25 years or something, yeah? Very impressive. Now, very bravely, for the companion Kit and Gary have taken on the task of surveying the development of the British parish right across the late medieval, early modern periods in just 12,000 words. And today they will offer some glimpses of their key lines of argument on the one hand, and perhaps also of the experience of co-authoring such a vast survey on the other. For the advanced reading, you may have seen a related book chapter published in 2019 entitled The Poor, the Pious and the Privileged, Toward a Social and Cultural Topography of Parish Participation in Late Medieval London, the link to which can be found on the History Seminar homepage. As for today, it's all very much work in progress, and I hope a welcome opportunity to gather some initial responses and feedback. After their paper, the respondent will be our own Joe Chick, who recently completed a PhD on late clerical relations in Reading over the 15th and 16th centuries. He has published several aspects of his work, including an article on the end of monastic rule in cultural and social history, and he's currently an early career fellow of our Institute for Advanced Studies. Finally, we will be looking forward to your questions and comments, either via raising your hand after the discussion or using the chat, which is accessible through the little symbol on the top of your screen at any point. But now, without further ado, a warm welcome to Kit and Gary and their talk on British parishes, history and historiography. Over to you two.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you for that nice introduction. Yes, Gary and I have been collaborating since the last century. I started to write about our collaboration and realized that the technological changes over the course of our collaboration were just too enormous to even contemplate, so I'm going to give this paper instead. There is nothing like an impossible task and little time to do it to focus the mind. Gary and I have worked together since the beginning of our careers. We know each other's strengths and weaknesses as writers and as humans, so writing this article together is not the impossible task. Rather, it is to write a comprehensive essay with a strict word limit on something we both know too much and too little about. We both know a great deal about the late medieval and early modern English parishes, and we now are learning a great deal about the Welsh, Scottish, and Irish ones. With an even tighter word limit for this talk, I'm going to use my time to explore problems and issues behind how historians have defined and conceptualized the English parish and its parishioners. I suspect that many in this audience routinely deal with parish councils, so this might seem an overly basic question because you know it to be a government unit defined by geographical boundaries. To be sure, there might be an old church nearby, but you and your family might be chapel, synagogue, mosque, or even the pub. So it really isn't relevant. And you probably don't consider yourself a parishioner, even if you go to parish council meetings and pay a parish tax. While a geographical and political definition has been at the heart of defining a parish since its inception, the ability to map boundaries has not remained constant, nor has the government, its writ, its ability to enforce that writ. So how to conceptualize a unit that has been around for 1,200 years or so when its context has shifted, when attitudes towards the expectations of government have changed, and when the nature of the polity has changed is difficult. And it makes the question of how to understand the parish and parishioners less straightforward. A quirk of how English bishops interpreted canon law in the 13th century is the starting point for much parish scholarship, including my own, because it gets to the heart of understanding the parish as more than a government or ecclesiastical unit of taxation, but one that was, in my view, a social and cultural one that made and refracted larger social and cultural concerns. Canon law required that in addition to paying tithes, the laity maintain the nave of their parish church and supply it with the necessary liturgical items. The clergy were to care for the chancel, while landlords, either secular or monastic, probably oversaw these obligations initially. By the end of the 14th century, parishioners further down the social scale had begun to organize themselves in order to meet these needs. Led by lay leaders called church wardens or church reeves, they produced records that documented parish organization, leadership, and activities. These records called church warden accounts, drew the attention of 18th and 19th century antiquarians. As they became more familiar with the customs and quirks of their own parishes, local differences tugged at the call to understand or conceptualize the parish in a standard and unified way. 19th century scholars understood the medieval parish as a democratic institution. In 1857, when Toulmin Smith wrote his book, The Parish, the exercise of democracy was the organizing principle of his analysis. Motivated more by strong anti-Catholic sentiments than by empirical evidence, Toulmin Smith argued that the early medieval parish was a direct precursor to the 19th century one, a democratic unit of local government and not a religious unit at all. In 1890, the Anglican bishop Edmund Hobhouse marveled that, quote, the complex nature of the office of church warden did not deter parishioners from selecting females, end quote. Whether or not a religious unit, the parish practiced democracy with such commitment that included women, something that English democracy at the time did not. The religious concerns of the parish largely remained out of sight in the 1960s and 70s, even as scholars looked to understand peasants and the mechanisms of coercion. Here, the parish was a geographical unit with the demand to pay tithes making it a source of ecclesiastical exploitation, but whether its members were religious or not was not addressed. Implicitly, scholars assumed a general level of ignorance at the catechism and challenges to the clergy to be the stirrings of class consciousness. When the parish as a religious unit was rediscovered in the 1980s, the communal nature of the parish life was front and center, and debates about the quality of the religious practice was driven by sectarian concerns. Did parishioners know their catechism? Were they sincere? Did the Reformation free them from a corrupt and predatory medieval church? These questions, lobbed at the medieval parish by Reformation historians, directed the research and conceptual agenda for scholarship on the parish. Yet even as concepts of religion expanded and nuanced notions of community developed, how to think about the parish and lay participation still bedeviled scholars. Peter Burke's work on popular culture had an impact on these studies because the parish as a lay-managed unit was a locus of popular as opposed to elite religion. This concept, however, seemed to impugn either implicitly or explicitly the merits of late medieval religious practice because of its association with the uneducated and therefore unchristian masses. In 1992, in his Stripping of the Altars, Eamon Duffy introduced the concept of traditional religion to counter these Reformation-inspired images of an uneducated and uncommitted Christian and a moribund and corrupt church. Traditional religion described that which was practiced before the Reformation without judgment and transcended the class divisions implied by the term popular religion. It was a unity that reflected Christian theology. Transforming the parish from a unit of popular religion to a unit of traditional religion focused attention not on green men, maypoles, or body out-of-control processions, but on the fact that learned and unlearned alike said the same prayers, attended the same church, and venerated the same saint. The model of traditional religion occludes status and gender identities because they challenge a unitary picture of the laity and the acceptance of Christian doctrine and sincerity of religious practice. Women might pray to a specific female saint, but gender and class analysis undermined the unity of religious practice and detracted from proving the reformers wrong about the quality of medieval religious life at the local level. Wrestling with whether or not the parish was a secular or religious institution, a government tool of coercion and oppression, or a nascent democratic community ultimately forces the question of who was a parishioner. The New Testament asserts that men and women were equal in the eyes of God. All Christians were to receive the sacraments at the proper appointed time, follow the 10 commandments, and practice the 7 works of mercy. Yet these requirements, which have material form, mean that men and women and the rich and the poor did not and could not participate equally in God's church. Indeed, much of the scholarship on the late medieval English parish debated the nature and extent of parishioner involvement. Who was involved? How deeply? And what does this involvement signify? While scholarship in the 80s and 90s abandoned questions of the relationship between democracy and the parish, the issue of how broad parishioner involvement was still underlay discussions of late medieval parish life. Did everyone within the geographical boundaries count, or was participation predicated on status, wealth, and gender? Some argued that the gentry had fled the parish, leaving it in the hands of the peasantry. The idea of traditional religion countered that the late medieval emphasis on the Eucharist promoted inclusion and community, and that everyone participated. It fostered a range of voluntary forms of religious participation that attracted widespread involvement across status and gender. Still, others contended that the parish was the bastion of local elites who used the parish to promote their lineage and curry favor with powerful ecclesiastical lords. As with debates about the quality of citizenship or democracy in contemporary societies, something that the United States is in fact wrestling with right at this very moment, reaching agreement about the quality of late medieval parish involvement is difficult because although there were medieval guidelines for parish participation, historians have few possibilities for easily measuring that participation. Difficulties with sources, disagreement over definitions, and the significance of involvement, and the lack of proper measuring devices hamper consensus on this issue. Moreover, medieval Christians did not think about church participation in the same way as modern historians. All Christians were parishioners, but involvement itself was neither equal nor always voluntary. As a result, statements about acting with, quote, the assent and by the commandment of the whole parish remain unclear. Did the whole parish include women, the unmarried, the poor, or only householders? Even medieval parishioners disagreed. In 1519, one of the church wardens from Tavistock, Devon, testified that decisions should be made by, quote, the more part and substantial men of the parish, while his opponent, another former church warden, claimed that any such request or desire made by certain persons to the parish of 6 or 8 and not by the whole inhabitants and rulers of the said parish was invalid. The sources that historians use most frequently for assessing parish participation are church warden accounts and wills. English church warden accounts only begin to survive in any number from the 15th century. Whatever these records do and do not record, they do not obviously document how broadly or narrowly parishioners participated in their parish's affairs. Moreover, because they are financial records, they force historians to consider participation in economic terms, discounting activities that left no financial trail or were outside the purview of church wardens. Another problem is distinguishing between individual and household participation. When the church warden's accounts report a few pennies received from a father for his child's funeral, should we assume the mother was uninvolved in that donation? Wills present similar problems. These sources imply that those with more money participated more. While the wealthy had more to give and their giving was far more visible, the Bible taught that God valued the widow's mite more. On one level, there is no solution given the sources we have, but we can make it a more interesting problem by adding gender to the mix and understanding that in addition to status, gender shaped participation and attitudes towards participation. We need to go beyond simply noting women's presence and start thinking about how parish participation in all its many forms was inherently gendered. Mentioning 1 or 2 women does not solve the problem, since an isolated example creates an idiosyncratic anomaly, and when women are understood as anomalies, they are either Queen Elizabeth I or are hysterical, dangerous, or subversive. We see this in the treatment of Elizabeth Glanfield, who led a revolt against Henry VIII's religious reforms. Glanfield and a group of other women tried to prevent artisans from removing the rood screen in a church in Exeter. They were so fierce that at least one worker was forced to jump from a window for fear of his life. I learned about Glanfield in Robert Whiting's 1989 book, Blind Devotion of the People, where he argued, based on stagnating parish revenues in Devon and Cornwall, that there was a general acceptance of religious reforms. Said in the context of religious apathy, Blandfield and those other women appear fanatical. They could not have been expressing religious devotion because they're outside the mainstream. This treatment was similar to 19th century historians' constructed exoticism of women who served as church wardens. They never asked why could some women become church wardens, and what did that tell us about the parish or parish leadership, broadly speaking. This point is methodologically important. The parish, as a geographical and religious unit, oversaw socialization and promotion of the faith and administration of the sacraments. Morality and sexuality were monitored, corrected, and punished at the parish level, with the law and medieval Christianity holding different standards according to status and gender. Women were a part of the parish regardless of how frequently or infrequently they appear in the records. Gender informs religious practice, and it forces the question of context on the actions of men, because scholars must ask if they are acting on their own or on behalf of their households. Lastly, gender allows scholars and readers to see how difficult it is to put into social practice the idea that men and women have spiritual equality, when men and women, just as the rich and the poor, do not have equal access to the holy, as is made manifest in the material culture of the parish. As Beth Allison Barr has shown, gender needs to be applied to parish life because it is implicated in providing pastoral care. The belief that women were particularly prone to sexual sin posed a problem for the clergy because Christian theology demanded that men and women have equal access to the sacraments. At the same time, women's existence threatened clerical celibacy. Thus, it remained difficult for women to receive pastoral care independent of the male authorities governing them. So serious was this concern that pastoral care manuals sometimes advocated that women not be prescribed fasting as a form of penance, lest it reveal to their husbands or households that they were atoning for a sin. By continuing to render the vast majority of women in the parish invisible, scholars have not only missed understanding women's religious concerns, they have missed understanding how gender-informed participation shaped communal change and situated behavior. In thinking about the parish as a gendered unit, we can then conceptualize it as a forum for self-promotion and social identity, both of which were critical for understanding lay involvement in the parish. And while these themes might not appear very Christian to modern sensibilities, self-promotion and social identity were very important in the Middle Ages. The parish socialized men and women into acceptable gender roles, but at the same time, activities conducted within the parish context were spiritually beneficial and thus gave women leeway to act for the improvement of themselves and their communities. Women expressed their desires in a religious idiom and used Christianity and their parish participation to navigate this misogynistic world and to justify their own behavior. These opportunities did not go unnoticed or unchallenged, and both the clergy and laymen routinely interpreted them as lust, ambition, and vanity, not piety, devotion, or spirituality. But this is part of living in a gendered and misogynistic world. Memories of the parish similarly show discourse of gender to be central to parish life. And here I'm drawing on Brona Kane's excellent new book, Popular Memory and Gender in Medieval England. 13th century mandates for annual confession made memory and introspection important tools in the clergy's assessment of the laity's spiritual health. Memory and introspection were, therefore, central to the laity's encounter with ecclesiastical authority. Court testimonies about local life and events, many of which took place within the context of the parish, deployed the discourses of gender, sexuality, and status current in their social worlds. And they reveal how men and women understood their world and the social forces constructing it. We learn that people assumed that the male life cycle included a period before marriage of sexual experimentation and physical mobility. Many of these male homosocial activities were cast in terms of fulfilling parish or parish guild obligations and were expected and celebrated. Women had fewer such opportunities, and beliefs in women's irrationality and lack of intellect dominated assumptions about their untrustworthiness. Their claims and authority were routinely challenged by misogynistic attitudes towards speech and double standards of behavior. These gendered assumptions led rather unquestioningly to male leadership within the parish and shaped expectations for how leadership was both understood and enacted. With this awareness of how the parish was so profoundly gendered, we can ask new questions about observable changes in parish culture and participation. The rise of all-women parish groups or guilds and the parish's co-optation of Hocktide, a female and marriage-centered holiday in the mid-15th century, women's growing interest in effective piety performed around the body of Christ, and the growing list of female church warden accounts in the 16th century all show the late medieval parish changing around issues of women and gender. And these changes have implications for understanding the wider world of late medieval England. Thank you.
Okay. Part of what we have to do with this essay for the Brill Companion, of course, is to go across the British Isles. So like typical Americans, we're going large, we're supersizing. And that's a different kind of problem than the one that Dr. French was talking about. So this is what I'm going to talk about. The parish may have been one institution, but it was certainly an elastic one. By the late Middle Ages, the British Isles had an impressive network of parishes that operated in vastly different contexts. They are mostly still there, yet an examination of the historiography of parish studies finds uneven coverage across the Isles. In my part of this talk, I will try and sketch out how this is so by examining the events of how the events of the 16th century influence the three kingdoms in very different ways. First, I'm going to start off by citing some information I found from an essay by Andrew Foster. Evidence accumulated for Archbishop Whitgift in 1603 indicates England possessed 9,244 parishes. Scotland probably had 1,136 parishes at the start of the Scottish Reformation, but that was soon reduced to 1,028 because of closure and mergers. I don't know of an estimate for Ireland as a whole, but in the Middle Ages, but in 1861, the census lists 2,428 civil parishes, and many of those parishes correspond to parishes in the Church of Ireland, which is suggestive. In general, England's parish network was denser in the south than in the north. Geographic areas could range from between 2 and 4 acres in places such as London and Norwich, to 1,000 acres in the Midland, to 20,000 acres and greater in northern England. The evidence from 1603 indicates 25% of England's parishes were in the dioceses of Lincoln and Norwich. And to make up for the great distances that could exist between some parish churches, chapels existed with only partial cursules and burial rites. And that's part of the parish process too. The approach to pre-Reformation records in England can be filled. Okay, sorry, I've skipped over a line. I've skipped over a paragraph. Authors who have written about the parishes have written about it differently depending on numerous factors, but I think the first place we have to start is who these authors are. I think they write differently depending on when they wrote, where they live, and what they believe. National identities and religious sensibilities can even influence academic analyses. Anglican authors can express complex relationships with the parish because Anglicanism has always acknowledged continuity across centuries, even as it stresses that the reforms of the Tudor era have proved fundamentally beneficial and Protestant ideas liberating. Thus, the approach to pre-Reformation records in England could
Carrie, I'm afraid we've lost you there. Kit, can you take over? Is that possible?
I can. I haven't seen how he's revised it last night, but yes.
Okay.
So let's see. In Scotland, 1560 and the establishment of the Scottish National Church is a crucial moment in the nation's history. Modern historians of Scotland are more interested in towns and burghs than they are in the parish. In Ireland, the history of the parish is a contested history, as we shall see. As a person who studies the Reformation and parishes, especially London's parishes, I, that is Gary, am of the opinion that the Reformation and the experience of the Reformation by parishes are two very different and complex topics, and exceedingly difficult to tackle in one study. In fact, I am not certain it has been done yet. Many surveys of the English Reformation, from Dickens to Haig to Brigden for London and to Marshall, might cite examples for parishes. Should we let Gary back in?
That'd be good.
Hi, I've just mentioned Marshall might cite examples for parishes as evidence of the impact of larger trends, but their method is to cite discrete examples or lines from sources. This is not a flawed method. It can work very well, and we will employ it to some degree, but it can be better or worse depending on the argument it collapses and the complexity of the locality. Are you there? Rural internet in the United States is really unreliable. The newspaper reports that you might have read about are true. Conversely, studies that are parish-driven, from Kümin and French to Coster to Duffy to Gibbs, make references to large issues connected to reforms, to injunctions in sermons and legislation. But these macro forces are typically cited with minor explanation and no larger context. And in my case, if I mention the Chantries Act, for example, I assumed people would already know what I was talking about, or they could go look it up. The struggle has been to merge the two issues together, giving equal status and a seamless story, but given the complexity, I am not certain a complete joining of Reformation studies and parish studies will occur, but their associations as two closely related fields has proven incredibly beneficial for scholarship on all sides. Gary?
Should I let you? I keep losing connection. So should I try and read, or should we keep doing this, or should you read?
You can read. Leave your picture off. That might help with the connection. Or.
Okay. So where are you?
I'm at the paragraph, part of the problem.
Part of the problem is also a great blessing. I'm going to take a moment, since this has already kind of gone sideways. I live in the country.
I already explained we have no rural internet.
Exactly. So sorry about this. I should have gone to my office. Part of the problem is a great blessing too, because England possesses a great deal of parish documentation. Of course, we would all wish for more, but it has 662 church warden accounts that survive from the pre-modern period. More than 200 of those are from the pre-Reformation era, along with parish registers, vestry minutes, wills, collection lists of various sorts, inventories, and more. In London, 11 church warden accounts survive from the 15th century. There were no directions from either the church or the state that required maintenance of these financial records. But it seems that a combination of political, social, religious, and cultural forces helped encourage their production. Unlike church warden accounts, the survival of other categories of parish records in London do connect to political requirements. Most obviously are the inventories created at the end of the reign of Edward VI. Extant parish registers from London tend to be connected to key dates, such as 1558 to 1509, the original order to maintain them, or 1557 to 1559, the end of Mary's reign and the transition to Elizabeth's reign. Vestry minutes survive irregularly from the pre-Tudor era, but you can find memorandum. As a set of distinct records, they exist with abundance in the Elizabethan period, demonstrating the increased importance in parish government. The vestry exercised a range of responsibility by the end of the Tudor period for dealing with things such as the plague, for looking for Anabaptist literature, for Jesuits, for Romish rabble, for assessing fees for clerks and sextons, and for adjudicating issues of parish philanthropy. This pattern of source survival from London does not establish a model for the entire kingdom, but it is highly suggestive, I think, and it does show how certain kinds of sources are connected to the interest of the government. In England, the parish church metamorphosed from an institution that prayed for the dead and invoked saints to an institution that preached the word and practiced philanthropy, especially poor relief. Religious guilds might have vanished, but people could still collect money for special functions. Beyond that, monasteries disappeared, and so did the heavy influence of monastic culture on parish religion. Women might have lost an option to enter a convent, but emerging Calvinist culture explicitly stated in marginal glosses in the Geneva Bible that nobody had a right to arrange a marriage for a woman without her consent. And by the 17th century, elite educated women able to read their Bibles and oversee the education of their children exchanged letters with other women in networks of information and support. Perhaps a good way to end this section on England, if I can stay in the group, is to say something about the impressive book, Altars Restored, The Changing Face of English Religious Worship from 1574 to 1700 by Kenneth Fincham and Nicholas Tyack. The authors argued that the logical starting point for the religious policies of Charles I was to go to the reign of Edward VI, when altars had first started to be destroyed as a matter of government policy. While examining government policy, ecclesiastical requirements, and theological formula, the authors continually acknowledge that these changes took place in parishes. They are not abstract ideas, but they have a material and geographic reality. Moving to Scotland, documentation of the Scottish parish is problematic, especially prior to 1560. Some parish records survive, but not in great quantities. In fact, not hardly any, just a few. Parish studies that are set in the Middle Ages are dominated by the methods of archaeology, architecture, and art history. As in England, the post-1560 Scottish parish developed numerous civil functions, such as a new, more systematic approach to poor relief, the maintenance of parish registers, and new responsibilities for education. But the records that emerge, that the people that in the period that become the focus of modern scholarship, are the consistory court records. These records are connected to an institutionalized system of Christian discipline that emerged in those parts of Europe that assiduously followed the teachings of John Calvin. In the Reformed tradition, marks of a valid church were A, the proper preaching of the word, and B, the proper administration of the sacraments. In 1560, the Scottish Church adopted a third based on the Genevan model, namely ecclesiastical discipline uprightly administered as God's word prescribes, whereby vice is repressed and virtue nourished. This interpretation of Scripture became the foundation for another characteristic of the early modern parish in Scotland, and something unique in the British Isles, namely the introduction of the consistory court and Kirk sessions. Many of the session records are now at the National Records of Scotland. Others are in regional archives. Some have been digitized and are online. Some have been transcribed and have been published. They're readily available, in other words. While the post-1560 Kirk system empowered a parish clerk and a group of elders to oversee the local community, the focus of this godly discipline changed over time. In the beginning, meaning the 1560s, regulating sexuality was a major concern. By the time you get to the 1590s, lots of other concerns that could be potentially the issues of social disorder have also written to equal status in the records. Many people have focused on the intrusive nature of the Kirk sessions, but Kirk sessions may have been a welcome presence in the community. That's Margot Todd's argument. The Scottish Reformation was a process that was neither easy nor straightforward. For example, parishes were tasked with finding acceptable ministers. They struggled. Some parishes hired Reformed clerics more quickly than did others. And some parishes shared services of a minister. Other parishes hired readers to recite prayers and read Bible passages but they did not deliver sermons that they had written, these readers. Educated Reformed ministers were always in short supply, especially in the first decades of the Reformation. But the number of appointments increased and decreased, especially across Fife. The Fife parishes demonstrated a similar pattern in that it takes many 5 to 10 years to acquire a university-educated Reformed pastor. Many have their own during the 1570s and 80s, but by the 1590s, they are back to sharing one with a neighboring parish again. Conversely, the Parish Kirk of St. Andrews, Holy Trinity, had 2. The use of readers helped fill in this shortage, and they are essential to understanding how the new Reformed liturgy succeeded. The Reformed readers connected those with some education, with others of varying degrees of literacy, and those that are in oral culture. The readers, via song, repetition, imagery, could create numerous mnemonic devices to help enable participants of oral culture to learn the Reformed tradition. Revolution and Civil War arrived in the British Isles in the 1630s, and extant records from Scotland are significant for this period. The politicalization of the Kirk is made clear by the National Covenant in 1638 that sought to protect the purity of religion and the liberty of the Church through political action and an ongoing process of socio-economic ecclesiastical reform. Those are the words of Chris Langley, who continues, those who opposed the political agenda of the Kirk enshrined in the National Covenant were defined as enemies to reform and of the state. Well, this is, of course, during the height of sort of wars of religion, and all across Europe, I think lots of people who are resisting either religion or the state are seen as enemies or both. This is not aberrant. What the 17th century has introduced, however, is a time of social discord in which the Scots felt the need to protect themselves from England, followed by a war, Scottish occupation of Durham, and then the imposition of the Cromwellian system on Scotland. In the town of Ayr, during the 1650s, those who ran the Kirk sessions maintained the message that truth, faith, and the Scottish covenant with God will preserve the town and the nation. The Kirk and the Consistory worked for social cohesion. Moving to Ireland. Historians of Irish history have paid much less attention to parish records than scholars in England, but they have begun to look at them. This is likely because of the smaller amounts of sources that exist in Ireland and the contested historiography. A useful guide for surveying the records of Ireland is the essay by E.V. Monaghan in the book Views from the Parish, Churchwarden Accounts, 1500 to 1800, edited by Valerie Hitchman and Andrew Foster. Monaghan tells us that the rate of parish survival is much poorer in Ireland, and this incompleteness invites development of an Irish context to facilitate analysis of the records. Only one set of Proctor accounts from St. Werburgh and Dublin predates the Reformation. Regionally, when parish records do begin to survive in the 17th century, and still you only have a handful, they are mostly from the eastern part of the island. In fact, 17th century records are from Dublin. As for survivalism, sadly, over 1,000 parish registers are destroyed in the 1922 fire at the Dublin Parish Record Office. There are some that survive, and many of these have been digitized, and they are online. In Ireland, the era between 1534 and 1700 witnesses a dramatic politicizing and transformation of Irish institutions, which inevitably tied religious change to English domination, giving the Reformation a very different inflection in Ireland than either England or Scotland. This was the era of rebellions and wars. Once the Reformation occurs, attempts to implement English language liturgy causes many problems. The Dublin Parliament passed legislation 1536 to 37 that included 28 Henry VIII C-15, an act for the English order, habit, and language that required oaths from newly ordained clergy to employ English in their preaching, teaching, and prayers. This move preceded the Book of Common Prayer by more than a decade, and it built on 14th century precedents that had already attacked Irish clerics for having Irish-style haircuts and Irish clothing. In addition to the language, the appointment of people such as John Bale, who was made Bishop of Ossory and Leinster in the reign of Edward VI, exacerbated tensions, although it is more than likely that Irish parishes, especially in the west of Ireland, simply ignored any dictates regarding Reformation. An exception to this is the reign of Mary I, which some historians argued led to the cementing, the confessionalization of the Irish population into the Church of Rome, within the Church of Rome. Before and after the reign of Mary, highly educated clerics received appointments in English areas. And Munster and Ulster, newly arrived estate owners built churches while clergy had to preach and see to the pastoral needs, but they were expected to see to church upkeep with their tithe money. And they also had to maintain registers. Their prayer book, which received 8 publications in Ireland between 1571 and 1690, further enforced the undermining of Irish language and culture. Older historiographic models of the late 16th and early 17th century present Protestantism as a force from above and Catholicism as a force from below. But more recently, a model of dual confessionalization and dual identities, both Irish, has emerged in the literature. But just as social and religious divisions became fossilized into confessional divides, the wars of mid-17th century and the numerous massacres that occurred in the 1640s occur, and they touch most of the island. The 18th century would be a quieter century, but the memories of the bloodshed become memories ingrained in Irish history. Given the social and political friction and the unevenness of documentation, scholarly approaches to the parish in early modern Ireland cannot rely on the kinds of methodologies used by English people in English parish studies, since the accounts do not, since the Irish surviving church-born accounts do have very little consistency. For example, many Irish church-born accounts only exist as documentation of extraordinary expenditures, such as building accounts, and then they go silent again. Thus, quantitative approaches, as have been performed with the English church-born accounts, are not applicable. However, the idea of maybe tracing building projects, architectural transformation, and local economic connections, these lines of inquiry do have potential. Thus, what we see is that parish operations certainly exhibited differences in the Middle Ages, but that the events of the 16th century moved the 3 kingdoms into very different positions. England possesses a rich heritage of parish records and has produced numerous scholars and archivists with vested interest in maintaining and researching them. Ireland has one set of proctor accounts in the pre-Reformation period and few parish records until right at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. In both Ireland and Scotland, material culture dominates the scholarship of the Middle Ages. It's archaeology, it's looking for stones, it's that kind of stuff. For Scotland, the study of the Kirk session gains attention after 1560, but local history is town history, it's burgh history. The events of the 16th century have produced enduring effects on institutions, people, and our research interest. Hopefully, the academic world is not still fighting the Reformation, but the parish sources and modern interest rest upon those early modern foundations. And I'm sorry for the interrupted reading, but I'm sure Kit did a really good job.
Thanks very much to both Kit and Gary, also for soldiering on in the adverse circumstances of the cyberspace here, which is always a risk, of course, that we have. It was a really broad, fascinating panorama, combining thematic approaches with regional perspectives, pointing to many of the problems of uneven source survival and the different historiographies and approaches that scholars have used in the 3 kingdoms. Can I now invite Joe for his response, please?
Yes, yeah, I would say thanks as well, obviously, for an interesting talk. And given you had the almost impossible task of having 1 word per year of parish history, I think you did a good job of, summing up the longue durée. And what I was going to talk about in my response is to focus on one particular issue to do with participation in the parish. And I'll try and to cover the kind of longue durée theme. I'll talk a bit about late medieval era, in particular Reading, which I've been studying, and go through to looking at parish meetings in the year 2021 as well. So we've heard, obviously, the theme participation a bit in terms of financial contributions recorded in the church wardens' accounts, and also in particular in terms of the differences in experience between men and women in terms of how they participated in the parish. And of course, another form of participation is in terms of the actual decision-making process in the parish. So I was going to maybe talk a bit about that aspect of parish history and how that would have worked historically and now. So historically, medieval parishes obviously had their kind of annual assembly, which was attended by quite a broad range of parishioners. But what we don't know so much from the records is kind of what role, if any, those attending actually had in the decision-making. And each year there would have been the church wardens elected at these meetings, and often parishes had 2 church wardens, was quite a common model, with one who had already served for a year acting in a senior role and a newly appointed one in a junior role. And with church wardens' accounts being the dominant extant source from the medieval era, the official of the church warden is sometimes seen by some as the leading official in parish decision making. But that's not completely accepted, obviously, and the predominance of the church warden is contested in particular by Clive Burgess, and he argues that it was a body known as the Masters who took the key decisions in the parishes. And his case is based on detailed case study of the parish of All Saints in Bristol. And then elsewhere in England, we find comparable groups, sometimes called the Masters or sometimes called the 8 Men or the 12 Men. And based on what I found in Reading, I wonder whether, even though this group certainly does exist elsewhere, maybe this wasn't necessarily a standard model that was followed in all parishes. In Reading, there were 3 parishes called St Lawrence's, St Mary's and St Giles's. And Clive Burgess's model does seem to very definitely apply in St Mary's. Here the accounts seem to quite regularly refer to a group called the chiefest of the parish and to special seats for the masters and their wives. But then in the St Giles's accounts, there's no mention of any body of parish masters at all in those records. And then in the third one, St Lawrence's, we have a sort of in-between situation there, where the accounts do refer at one point to a decision being taken by the worshipfuls of the parish. That's the terminology used there, but this only turns up in one instance. And St Lawrence's is particularly interesting because within the accounts, they have an ordinance of 1547, which has quite an interesting preamble, which names those attending the meeting in a way that seems to imply an order of precedence. The first person it names is the town mayor, then it names 2 former mayors, then it names the vicar, then the 2 church wardens, and then 7 other named individuals who are all burgesses of the town. And finally, it refers to the diverse inhabitants of the parish. So the specified individuals do add up to the number 12, so that body may well have been the 12 men. And what's interesting about that is that the group here does seem to include the church wardens rather than being a separate higher authority. So that's the kind of historical context that I was going to talk about. And then I wanted to move right through to the current situation in parishes, and think maybe a bit about participation now and how parishes are viewed now. So those of us involved in parish studies, and there do seem to be quite a lot of people from the My Parish Network, would normally see our interest as quite specialised and not of huge broad public appeal. And Katherine French obviously mentioned about how a lot of people now, even those involved in parish councils, don't necessarily kind of think of themselves as parishioners. But this kind of slight disconnect from parish council meetings has changed quite dramatically in recent months, and there's one episode that has at least fleetingly drawn quite a lot of interest in parish council meetings. Those of us from Britain might have guessed that I'm referring to the now notorious Handforth Parish Council meeting of the 10th December 2020. And as we have 2 speakers from America, they may have managed to avoid this particular episode, but they may be surprised to hear that as it currently stands, the highlights video of this parish council meeting has had 3.3 million views across the world. And it all revolves around a parish council meeting that descends into complete chaos. And the situation there was an outsider from, I think, is the district or possibly county council called Jackie Weaver, who'd been brought in to tackle complaints about bullying behaviour within the parish. And it's certainly fairly evident that there were problems with bullying when you watch this video. And there's a number of fairly unpleasant men who may kind of not speaking even remotely courteously, who then systematically get ejected from this meeting. And I think it's easy to see this meeting perhaps as just an kind of funny episode, but actually it does maybe tell us a little bit about how parishes are viewed and how they kind of operate now. It would be fair, for one thing, to assume that 3.3 million views is probably the most scrutiny that any parish council meeting has probably ever had in history, so that in itself makes it an important event. And this person, Jackie Weaver, has become something of a celebrity now and has had a song written about her by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and the whole meeting has received attention not just in Britain but beyond. I noticed that the CNN website did have an article where it posed these big questions to the reader. Was the Zoom meeting of the century called illegally? Had all participants read and understood the standing orders? And most importantly, did Jackie Weaver have the authority to kick Handforth Parish Council chairman out of the discussion? So while it is quite a funny episode, it maybe does tell us a bit about parishes today. And for one thing, considering why people found it funny maybe has implications about the current perceptions of parishes. It seems likely maybe that the source of humour was in seeing such a heated debate around what a lot of people might see as quite trivial affairs. And that perhaps reinforces what Katherine French was saying about the kind of sense of distance from the parish that most people have. And another way in which it kind of tells us a little bit about participation is the fact that it's the lockdown situation that made kind of this possible, this level of viewing. So the news has reported quite widely on how the video gone viral, but less on how this actually happened. And it appears to have begun with an East London A-level politics student called Shan Ali, and he was bored in lockdown and had begun watching parish council meetings all over the country, something which wouldn't have been possible just a year before, obviously. And he found them surprisingly entertaining, and considering this handful one a particular gem, he posted a tweet that's now become quite an infamous video. So it shows that in the digital age, there's now kind of scope for parish operations to become increasingly visible, and perhaps a means for increasing participation and scrutiny. And the videos haven't just kind of been a source for amusement for people with no connection to Handforth. They have led to kind of genuine local scrutiny, and a councillor called Barry Burkle faced a no confidence vote following the spread of the video over his failure to intervene in bullying. So I kind of have two questions, I suppose, based on the historical themes. What do you kind of see as the extent of the participation in parish decision making, both kind of historically and across time? And then also kind of think about the modern era. How do you kind of see participation now? And do you think digital technology will have a kind of effect on engagement with the parish in the future?
Great, thank you very much, Joe. People are starting to fill some information and add some comments in the chat. So please feel free to use the chat if you have any questions or comments to make. But in the meantime, over to Kit and Gary to well, respond to the response and perhaps the questions that Joe has been raising.
So thank you, Joe. I did not know about the Handforth Parish Council meeting, and now I am going to clearly go down a rabbit hole, exploring that. So the extent of decision making in parish, medieval parish decision making, the extent of participation in medieval parish decision making. Again, I think we can't ever know, but I do think thinking about the question of individual versus household is important nuance to that question, because we can imagine all manner of decisions made at the parish council meeting that maybe the women weren't allowed to come to. And then when their husbands get home and the wives find out what has happened, they're like, oh yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And so, these issues may get revisited. So I think decision making is not, or it's something that people who miss the meeting, men who miss the meeting for one reason and another, also then force a negotiation of the issue. Anybody, and I would gather that many of us in the audience who have ever been to a department meeting when a major policy change is on the floor, there may be a decision made at the meeting, but when does it get implemented? Or is there backsliding? Or is there tweaking? Or is there foot dragging? Or is it just all in all ignored because, actually implementing it is just too hard? So, in that really awful academic way, I'm going to say, well, what do you mean by decision making? But I do think that that just at a very basic level, what do we mean by a household versus an individual in terms of participation becomes one of those really problematic sort of issues in trying to answer these questions, because households may make the decision, but that may drag things out. But how do you know it's the household? How do you know it's not the individual?
Gary?
The one thing that came to my mind, since I have been looking at London records recently, is the number of times when you get a hint at who's showing up at audits. And what you see is how, even if you want to sort of leave the idea that they're households and you want to say, well, they're individuals, how uneven their power might be. These are uneven power relationships, because you might have somebody for whom you have no real descriptions as to who they are, what they're just maybe a name next to somebody who's an alderman, and they know that. And so it's not like you have however many equal voices in the room. And once again, I think a faculty meeting is not a bad way to sort of consider it. That if somebody who's got seniority or who's a dean or who's an endowed chair says something, people are going to know that person just said this. And I think some people will be it's not a conversation that's a free conversation. I mean, we can't go back to that democracy. They're not all going in equally empowered to say what it is they want to say. It's an uneven forum from the very beginning. But it's a very rare sort of audit where you can actually reconstruct people to that degree. And so it's just a kind of insight. But so I think the idea is to sort of think, well, yes, these are perhaps struggles where the church wardens are having to sort of construct their authority, articulate their authority, and sort of maintain their authority in the middle of the audit. And people may have goodwill if there's been no problem in the course of the preceding year. But if there's been a problem, they may have people who want to undo that authority. And so I think it's a constantly socially negotiated moment, if that makes any sense.
I think the other thing is that because the parish is flexible enough that groups of people can band together and raise money to fix something or furnish something, that, the parish could agree that we're going to, put up this kind of banner or this kind of wall painting. But then another group actually raises the money and puts, a bug in the ear of the painter, and suddenly you end up with, St. Christopher as opposed to St. John or something. And it may have to be repainted, but also that's going to cost more money and maybe not. So there's other ways of circumnavigating the decision or kicking it down the road. And I think the parish's flexibility in accommodating subgroups is a part of that.
I think that's really something quite fundamental going on in the parish, if we sort of put it in the context of the sort of a general, atmosphere of the time. I think this is even below the town level. Yeah, London has 110 or so parishes, and in 110 of these units, you have political interaction going on. You have elections taking place. You have funding decisions being made. You have allocation of resources. So I think there's a little Republican time bomb there that is, planted in the midst of this monarchy. And Patrick Collinson used to remind us of these Republican elements. So I was interested to see that you brought up Toulmin Smith, who's now terribly old-fashioned. But I think he's still something, he's onto something there, that the parish, I think, is a fundamentally different kind of unit compared to the sort of, way in which the polity is run more generally.
Well,
can I invite people? Yeah, sorry, can I just invite people?
The fact that you get women as church wardens would be just the best evidence that they are something kind of different.
Yeah.
Even if those women church wardens are not, in fact, powerful or long lasting, the fact that it can happen, and it happens in more than one parish, is a sign that parishes are something else.
So and I want to add now to ask questions. Sorry, Gary, just sort of remind people that you can raise your hand. You can put a question in the chat. So this is the moment now to make yourself heard, please. Sorry, Gary.
Well, I just want to add is while I think you're right, the elements of, if you want to argue elements of republicanism or elements of democracy are there, I think you've got a good foundation. I just want to be able to argue that we can't idealize or romanticize these things. Because we have to remember, I think, that democracy is messy. And,
really?
I've heard, yes. So, and that's just my 2 cents. It's that we have to understand that there's all sorts of probably levels of intimidation and silencing going on in these elements.
Same time. Okay, Tim.
Hi, everybody. To me, one of the big differences between parish government and any other type of government is that you can't avoid the electorate. You can't avoid the people who put you there, or the people who you're responsible to, or the people whose taxes you're spending. In that there may be formal parish council meetings where people can come and say whatever they want, but actually that's not the time that people engage with you. They engage with you in the pub. They engage with you on the playground. They engage with you in the street, and they accost you with their concerns, their worries, all the time. And it's that kind of immediate relationship that people who serve on parish councils have with their local village that you don't get in any other form of government. So, you know, the county or the district or your MP, well, it's very easy to be anonymous and to make decisions that affect other places. Whereas when you're making decisions that affect the place that you live and your children live and your friends live, it just creates a fundamentally different dynamic, I think.
Thanks, Tim. So the sort of interrelation, Sarah, sorry.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. I'm a 19th century historian, 18th and 19th century, and I also wrote that little piece on Jackie Weaver that I put in the chat that brings the story up to date. But one of the things that I was interested in when I was looking at women and the politics of the parish in the 19th century was how the suffrage movement, for example, looked back to the medieval and the early modern period as a time where women were able to participate. And it was, in their narrative, it was the architects of the 1832 Reform Act and the architects of the 1835 Municipal Corporations Act that pushed women out of politics. In fact, women were still able to participate in parish government and elections all the way through the 19th century, but that didn't necessarily suit the narrative of the suffragettes. And a number of I'm sure you know, that a number of key texts on Scottish and English government and women's role in it were written by members of the suffrage movement as a way of advancing their cause. So just because this is a discussion of the longue durée, I thought it would be helpful to know that how the parish continues, and as Tim has said, it still continues, particularly in small rural communities like the one that he lives in and the one that I live in. It is still a really important form of government, and it keeps getting, you know, the narrative of participation and what local democracy sort of means on the ground is continually reinvented, as we've seen with the Jackie Weaver affair. You know, getting control of the parish is really important still. So it's not really a question, but it's a comment.
Yeah, so I think the sort of other interesting thing is that this is all coming out of the sort of Catholic Church establishment, yeah, of the Middle Ages, which is typically seen as this enormously hierarchical institution that is very authoritarian and centrally directed. And actually within the structure of that church is a lay-generated kind of community, which now has fed, in England in particular, into the basic form of local government. So this kind of participatory or relatively participatory unit comes out ultimately of the hierarchical structures of the late medieval church against the church's explicit wish, which always saw these lay people and these funds as subordinates of the church, but gradually they moved out of the control of the church and became independently lay administered kind of funds. So that's another interesting twist to the story, that this sort of basic participatory unit came out of a environment that is usually not seen as very participatory and bottom up. Now, one of the problems we have in the companion is that we have, very many different thematic units. So obviously you two cannot cover all of these grounds, but I was just going to ask you about music as well. Do you think that music has a big role to play in the story that maybe you can't tell, but that we need to tell about the parish? Because music and art, I guess, when we walk into a parish church these days, particularly in England, they can be quite bare. They can be quite sort of, monochrome. Is there a big story to tell there, do you think?
I actually do think that art is important. And actually, a bunch of years ago, I was at a Courtauld conference. And I was working on my project on London and houses. I was not working on parishes, and I hadn't really thought about parishes in a while. And I was really stunned at how many parish papers there were, and it was all about parish art. And so suddenly the parish had sort of, erupted and is completely different as a topic in this completely different location than I had sort of been thinking of. So I think, yes, there is in fact much to be said about art and architecture. I know next to nothing about medieval music, so I promise you we're not touching that. And while I'm willing to learn many, many things, I was banned from singing in public because I can't carry a tune in a bucket. So I think that we'll leave that to somebody else. But not talking about it doesn't mean it's not an important story.
And not just music, but bells too.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I just experienced it once when I was underneath a church steeple when the bell ringers were just started practicing, and I didn't know it was coming. And just the sound of those bells when you're standing underneath it, you have to really experience it. And of course, the people for centuries who lived around these parish churches would have experienced it, and they would have known what many of the bells being rung throughout the day meant. And but given our task at the moment, there are just choices that have to be made, and I suspect music and bells and some other things might be
fall by the wayside.
Yeah.
Joe.
There we go. Yeah, I was going to just follow on from what Bayat was saying, the point before the music one, I suppose, where he was talking about some of the extra roles that kind of political roles that the parish started to get under the Tudors in particular, which was, even though it traditionally been an ecclesiastical unit of area, obviously the parish. So I was wondering, what do you think, what was the feature about the parish rather than the ward, which was, I suppose, traditionally the political unit of local government? What was the feature about the parish that kind of made it the kind of one that actually ended up becoming the kind of unit of local government rather than what actually had traditionally been the local political unit of government?
Well, that's an interesting question. Maybe the wards had more legal protection defending them than the parish did. And if you're already redefining what the church is, they are more open to sort of being slightly manipulated and redefined. That's a guess. But I do find it interesting. It is that even when you are into the sort of really more vocally Protestant period of the early modern period, I hate to use the word Puritan, and we all know why, but even when you're there, the parish still is there too. And so even when people are wanting to really follow the Bible and do what the Bible says regarding their religion, and there's not a parish mentioned in the Bible, that's not undone. So maybe there's something utilitarian about it too. They just saw it as necessary and useful. And what else were you going to do if you didn't have a parish around a local church? It just had to be. But there were laws that defined the city, its liberty, and laws that defined the ward. And maybe it's hard to sort of answer this question because I don't think there's anybody ever sat down and wrote out why they were doing what they were doing.
I can just bring in the chat here as well. Tony Gale said that we should also look at manorial juries and manorial courts as possible sort of elements feeding into this story alongside the wards that Joe's been talking about. So Kit, for instance, from your London, Westminster background, well, is that helpful way to think about things?
I think this is the thing that, our modernists often, or at least my modernist colleagues often forget, the Middle Ages is just a moment of, or a time of kings and corruption as far as they can tell. And that there are all these participatory organizations or participatory bodies that we see all over the place in medieval Europe. So juries, ward juries, manorial juries. I think the fact that the parish is a unit transcends both urban and rural, makes it convenient. You don't have to reinvent the wheel as you're reinventing the church. That there's just a pragmatic quality to picking up the parish. But I think that, yeah, there's all kinds of ways of participating, although we know that women, are rarely in juries. So again, participation is rather constrained. I think the other thing that I would warn against and I worry about is this over-determination that seems to be creeping into our conversation. I don't think that these local participatory bodies necessarily are going to, it's not inevitable that we're going to end up with 19th, 20th, 21st century versions of democracy. I mean, we can look back and see that that's what happened, but we can look back in other places that had similar kinds of participatory groups and discover that they don't then lead to something else. There are neighborhoods in Beijing that have, a participatory neighborhood thing, but you look at, government as a whole in China, and it doesn't look very democratic. So I worry about this creeping inevitability that we're putting into the conversation.
Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much. So my question really, I guess, is to push Gary a little bit further about this sort of broader perspective that he's been taking, and I wonder if you could just say something about the process of colonization and parishes, because the parish is quite an interesting export as part of that process, but it also may reflect sort of similarities and differences between those colonial contexts and the British context that you've been talking about, but also indicate changing priorities in the way in which the parish is conceived and constructed. I wonder if you could just say something about that process, perhaps in different colonial spheres.
Well, I'm going to stick. I think there's a historiographic tradition of arguing that one can look at Ireland as a kind of colonizing space. So I'm going to stick to that rather than going off to other places, since Ireland is one of the things we have to write about, if that's okay. What you do find if you go to the early medieval period, of course, is that Christianity is going into Ireland, and that it's a very monastic-based kind of Christianity. And there are bishops, but bishops are frequently tied to the monasteries. And when you have the construction of a local church, the local church is usually being constructed that is associated with sometimes a local chieftain, and sometimes the local chieftain is, of course, associated with a local group, a kind of, I guess, kinship group. When you begin to get the arrival of Anglo-Normans, you begin to get constructions of Anglo-Norman lords, and you begin to get constructions of Anglo-Norman churches that look very much like English parishes. So one of the things that you begin to have by the time you get to sort of high Middle Ages is a divide between sort of the more eastern part of the island and the more western part of the island as to how the parish churches are actually even operating, what they look like, what their boundaries might be. And to such an extent that by the 16th century, according to several historians, I'll cite Stephen Ellis, the Archbishop at Armagh has two different structures, one dealing with the Anglicized eastern part of the island, and one dealing with the Gaelic western part of the island, with the recognition that he's not just dealing with two different cultures, but he's dealing with parishes that are operating fundamentally in different ways. And I think that that becomes part of the foundation that is in the Middle Ages. There are, I suspect people in the room know it better than I do, there are policies passed in the 14th century that are basically doing things with regulations that saying you cannot be Irish and a member of a cathedral staff trying to get the Irish clerics to give up their Irishness as far as clothing and hairstyle and things of this nature. So that by the time you get to the 16th century, which is the period which I am covering, I think there's already an association established of parishes that look and operate a certain kind of way being connected to the government and to the political structure that is across the ocean. There's kind of an Englishness to it versus the others that are in the West. And in the historiography, it is just a continual divide. I could have filled up a paper just basically saying in the Gaelic West and the English East. It's just a divide that is there. And most of the records that are created, at least in the early modern period, are coming in from the English parishes in the eastern part of the island that are operating according to a kind of English model. The western part is not doing it. Not until really late do you begin to get places like Galway producing parish records. I don't think they see the point of doing it. I don't know if that's good. That's the best I can do. I have to say, I'm not a trained Irish historian. It's a teaching field of mine, so I read up on it when I can. And of course, I've been reading up on it a lot for this essay. But that's the best answer I can give. Was it Tony that asked that?
No, it was me, Mark Knights. But thanks very much, Gary. Yeah, it would be really interesting to see how that plays out in different contexts. But that was an interesting response. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, we're going to have some coverage of this issue, Mark, in the companion, particularly with a focus on the Middle East and the sort of and the New World. But this is going to be a very, I think, difficult area to research because it's the comparative element there is even less, I think, advanced than it is within the British Isles and perhaps Europe in general. And just in that context, Marjolein has just posted on the chat that from a Flemish Flanders perspective, she's also very interested in parish participation, but that these questions are still very much debated there. And then she feels, you know, as a maybe compliment to Kit and Gary, that research is rather more advanced here than it is in your perception in some areas of the continent.
Thank you.
Good. Sorry. Yeah.
I said thank you.
Okay. So we're starting to approach this sort of envisaged endpoint of our seminar. Are there any other questions that you would like to ask? There's Michael, please.
Yes, I have a question about the Church Wardens' accounts. Have these been studied from the point of view of the history of knowledge? So it strikes me as a really rich source for thinking about the history of statistics before the state, the history of bureaucratic knowledge, the history of accounting. So I imagine the general tendency is to use these accounts as primary sources for historians, but clearly they were also an activity, an everyday activity for the wardens who had to compile them, which required a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge. I imagine there was a lot involved in maintaining these archives, accessing them, synthesizing them. So I wonder if they have been looked at from that point of view.
I did some of that in my first book on the people of the parish, and I looked at how church warden accounts were kept and created, especially since, at least for Bath and Wells, where I was working, I'm pretty sure that many of my church wardens were non-literate, but they understood perfectly well how these documents were supposed to work. So I didn't think about it in terms of the history of knowledge per se, but more in terms of uses of documentation by non-literate people. But yeah, it's a really interesting kind of question because you create, you know, these sort of literary communities around a practice of record keeping, mandated from outside, but figured out sort of locally. I don't think that I'm the last word on this, however. Just say.
Andrew. Yeah.
Andrew?
Hi there. Thanks very much for that. I just kind of thinking about that participation question, but also thinking about your longue durée, the whole business of I wonder whether the question I have for medievalists, really looking at it from an early modernist point of view, is that the participation, the sense that in the medieval pre-Reformation period, there were obligations on people in how they served the parish. And maybe that shifts later in terms of rights and so on, so that by the time we move on to the points you're making about democracy. But my question is really that, do you have evidence in the medieval period of people refusing to serve some of the offices, particularly church wardens? Because certainly by the 17th century, in a study I was involved with on Gloucester many years ago, it's quite clear that people were ducking out of that, so that there was that sense, which Sarah Richardson pointed out, that somehow our image is a medieval period. There were greater opportunities for a community for involvement, but that was steadily kind of eroded over the 17th and 18th centuries.
There are examples of men who refuse to serve. I also have in Bath and Wells, Nettlecombe does a rotation system. They don't elect, but it's rotated based on landholding. And the account survived for long enough that you see these two men who served twice. And clearly they're terrible at this, because there's all kinds of things that don't happen the years that they are church warden, but they happen in the years on either side of their time. And so they don't get out of it, but they do a terrible job. And then the third time that they should come up, they're gone. And of course, they could have died by that point, or moved on or something. But yes, there is this sense that some are better at it and some absolutely do not want to do it, either because it's an onerous position or it's going to cost them money or things like that.
Thank you.
If I can, I actually thought Andrew was going to say something else when I saw his hand went up in response to Michael's question, because I think there are two things that really proved helpful to me to sort of understanding how to approach church warden accounts. And one is the essay that Andrew wrote for the collection of essays we had, which it puts down sort of a context for records that survive and sort of their regionalism and where they're surviving, and in that are hints as to why. And then there was a book published back in the 90s, and this is bad because it's being recorded and I'm going on. I can't remember if the author is Cosby or Crosby now, if there's an R in there, but it was on the history of accounting and how accounting sort of came into Europe. And I don't remember his book talking specifically about church warden accounts, but it's a whole history of how this new method of accounting double ledger entries for credits and debits transformed the way Europeans dealt in their business world. And those two sources together are not exactly, have church warden accounts been dealt with in the history of knowledge, but they're very good at sort of creating this kind of context around the genre. And for what it's worth, I would throw those two things out.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should stick to our allocated time, and it remains for me to thank very warmly both Kit and Gary and Joe, and obviously everybody who's participated and listened in for taking part in this History Department research seminar. Before we close, can I just make the announcement that on the 8th of May, we'll have a parish symposium dedicated to parish power and politics. So very much the kind of issues of participation that we've focused on quite heavily in today's session. Our discussion will be available, hopefully, on the My Parish YouTube channel in the not too distant future. Sorry again about the little connectivity issues, but great for Kit and Gary to have soldiered on there. The next session of the History Research Seminar will feature a talk by Suzanne Dezen from Wisconsin-Madison on the French Revolution. So from me and from everybody who's been involved in the session, many thanks for taking part, and hopefully see you on another occasion.
Bye-bye.